today we have a very special guest from the U.S., Professor Jae-Kyung Lee. Jae-Kyung Lee is a professor at the State University of New York, Buffalo, in the U.S. And he's an internationally renowned scholar in the field of educational policy, particularly in the research field of achievement gap. So his work has appeared, virtually every single top journal, like American Education Research Journal, Education Researcher, Review of Education Research, just we could name it. And based on his contribution to the field, he was elected as a fellow of American Education Research Association a few years ago, and he was also the fellow of Institute of Advanced Study at Stanford University. So I'm so honored and happy to have him today. And he's going to talk about achievement gap, which is one of the most important and critical issues facing many schools in the U.S., probably in Australia as well. So he's going to talk about that in the U.S. context, but I believe he will talk about some lessons for Australians, right? So I'll hand over to you. All right.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Good afternoon. So it is my great pleasure and honor to share my research with you at the University of Canberra. And the title of my talk is For Whom the School Bell Rings, the case for closing educational inequalities and achievement gaps. The United States of America has been seen as a land of opportunity, equal opportunity for all people. And public education has been at the forefront of helping people realize their American dream, regardless of their racial and socioeconomic background characteristics. However, the notion of public school as a common good for all people is being challenged by increasing racial and socioeconomic divides in the country. And there are controversies about how well public schools are doing their job for student success, and how we should fix the schools if students are not successful. So in light of these questions, I'm going to talk about the following topics today. First, education policy goals, tension between excellence and equity, racial and socioeconomic achievement gap trends, and student, family, and school factors impacting the gaps, education and social policy interventions for closing the gaps, and finally, I'm going to discuss the lessons of the U.S. experiences and implications for Australia. My talk today is largely based on my recent book, The Anatomy of Achievement Gaps. The premise of this book was that winning the war on achievement gaps requires accurate information and mapping of the achievement gaps, because we cannot connect the dots if we don't know where the dots are in the first place. To give you a little bit of background history on the American War on Achievement Gaps, I'm going to start with the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education landmark Supreme Court decision that declared that the separate but equal is unconstitutional. And after that, school desegregation movement followed. 10 years later, War on Poverty, the Great Society initiatives by Lyndon Johnson administration launched. And at the same time, Civil Rights Act passed that prohibits the discrimination based on gender, race ethnicity, and the originality of the nation. A year later, Elementary and Secondary Education Act passed as a part of the War on Poverty programs, and that includes Title I program, so-called compensatory education program for the low-income, low-achieving students. Also, Head Start program, which is preschool program for low-income family kids. 1983 is a turning point when the federal education policy's focus shifted from equity to excellence. The Nation at Risk report came out to criticize the mediocre performance of American public schools and their students on international tests. And the standards-based education reform movement followed across all states, such as raising standards for teacher certification and raising standards for high school graduation, and so on. In 1994, Goals 2000 legislation passed. And one of the goals was United States becoming first in the world in math and science achievement. In 2001, No Child Left Behind Act passed. It tried to embody the then President Bush's promise to end so-called soft racism of low expectations by bringing all students' performance to proficiency level by 2014. In 2015, Every Student Succeeds Act replaced No Child Left Behind Act. It was a backlash against excessive federal control and over-testing under NCLB. And it tried to give power back to individual states about control over learning standards and school reform measures. So this is brief review of the American education policy history reveals the tension between excellence and equity goals. And of course, the goal of the public education system is twofold. Not only the narrowing the gap for the low achieving students, but also improving the overall achievement of all students at the same time. But in reality, the schools have been struggling to meet the both goals at the same time. So sometimes pursuing one goal at the expense of the another. To give you a sense of how large the achievement gaps are in the United States, I'd like to show you National Assessment of Education Progress, 4th grade math achievement gap measures. For your information, NAEP is very similar to the NAPLAN that you guys have in Australia. So this is a national assessment. So let me start with the black-white achievement gap. And here black refers to African American. The gap is about 26 points. And that is equivalent to about 80% of 1 standard deviation on the distribution of math achievement test scores, which is very large. And that is equivalent to almost 1 year worth of learning. So in other words, an average 4th grade black student may perform no better than an average 3rd grade white student in mathematics. Then Hispanic white gap, 21 points. And here Hispanic refers to the Latinos, mostly from the Central and the South America. So slightly smaller, but still very large. And then Asian white gap, Asian refers to Asian American. And in this case, the gap is very small, but Asians actually perform better than whites. And then poverty gap is 22 points. And the poverty gap is actually highly correlated with the black-white gap and Hispanic white gap because there are more blacks and Hispanics than whites who are in poverty. And then English language learner. This is basically, the immigrants with a limited English proficiency. And their gap is about 25 points. And then students with disabilities, 22 points. And of course, these are not all the gaps that we have to be concerned about, but this is just a sample of the gap. And one gap measure that I didn't include here is the Native American achievement gap, what we call the American Indian. The reason is because their population size is very small, less than 1% of the total population, and because this is a really sample assessment, and sometimes their test score report is not so reliable. But anyway, their gap is somewhere between black-white gap and Hispanic-white gap. Okay, now if you look at the black-white achievement gap trend over the past 4 decades, this curve is actual trend. So initially the gap was about 1.2 standard deviation, and then it narrowed down to about 0.8 standard deviation by early 80s. So substantial progress. But then the gap stopped narrowing further. But if that earlier trend of the narrowing the gap had continued, the gap would have been closed by now. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And very similar pattern of the gap trend for the socioeconomic groups, whether it's based on parents' education level or parents' income, similar trend. The gap narrowed, but then stopped narrowing further, or sometimes widened a little bit over time. So now the question is, what really worked? Why did the racial and socioeconomic achievement gaps narrow in the 60s and 70s, maybe up until early 80s? And I like to point out the collective vision and support for the Great Society. And as I mentioned, that the Great Society program tried to end inequalities by race, ethnicity, and income. And so in the 60s and 70s, there were multiple policies, not a single policy, actually package of the multiple policies work together to close inequalities and gaps. And that includes compensatory education program, school desegregation, equalization of school funding, social welfare, and affirmative action for underrepresented minorities. And the other question is, what didn't work? Right? And although that the gap narrowed, there were limitations. So first of all, the racial gaps narrowed without win-win in the 60s and 70s. So only blacks and Hispanics improved their achievement, but not whites. And then secondly, narrowing of the gap occurred mostly at the basic skills level. So only the low-performing students benefited from the policy, and not the high-achieving students. And then finally, the gap narrowed mostly at the preschool or primary school level, not the middle school or high school level. So it did not really sustain. So then the question is, why did the racial gap and socioeconomic gap as well, stop narrowing or even widen since late 80s and 1990s? Some people argue that black youth culture has deteriorated during that period, such as increasing high school dropout, increasing black single-parent family, and black male imprisonment. However, this kind of cultural argument may lead to blaming the victim. And the other argument is that institutional support did not really catch up with the higher expectations. As I mentioned earlier, during the early 80s, the policy focus shifted from equity to excellence, right? But social and educational environment really did not catch up to meet the higher expectations for the low-income minority students. So let's look at the black-white gap trend again, but this time not the achievement test scores, but the social and educational environment. And these are some selected indicators of that environment. But overall, you can see that there is a progress throughout the period, right? It goes downward. But you can also notice that some indicators actually stop making progress, or sometimes just slow down making progress. So the racial and social achievement gap trend seems to follow, or maybe reflect, the trend of the inequalities in social and educational environment, because we see some similarities of that trend. But of course, we cannot tell how much of different factors contribute to the trend. So I tried to kind of tease out the contribution of different factors. So this is just a statistical exercise based on the data. So here, if you look at these bars above the black, okay, these are the gaps relative to whites in terms of achievement test scores. The white bar is the original gap without any adjustment, okay? And like I said, it's around 0.8, right? In a standard deviation unit. But once we account for the students' entry-level achievement, prior achievement, what basically students bring from home, right, to school, their kindergarten entry achievement, that original gap drops by about 1/3. And then if you take into account family environment, then the gap drops down to additional quarter. And then finally, if you take into account school and teacher quality variables, then gap drops additional 10%. So the good news is that, let me start with the bad news. The bad news is that there is still 1/3 of the gap remaining, even after we account for all the student, family and school factors for blacks. Actually, for the Hispanics, actually the gap reversed once we account for all these things. But anyway, for the blacks, there is gap remaining. But I think the good news is that if students and schools, families, and communities work together as a team, I think this implies that there is a really great chance that we can close the achievement gap down the road. Okay, so far I talked about only the between group achievement gap issue. In other words, between different racial groups like black and white. But as you know that there is actually the even much greater gap within the same group, right? So in other words, within group gap is actually much larger than between group gap. So among students of the same race, like black students, some students succeed and some students fail, right? The question is why? So I'd like to introduce a real story of the two black kids who have same name, Westmore, And they grew up in the poor urban neighborhoods, and also they happen to have difficult fatherless childhoods. But all these things happened by coincidence, right? But then their faiths diverged. One of them, actually the author of this book, Westmore, became a White House fellow and successful business leader. But the other, Westmore, became a high school dropout and then later murderer. So right now I think he's in prison with a life sentence. So what made a difference to these two black kids? And according to the author of the book, Westmore, all of us make a difference. So this is a quote from the book. But basically what he's saying is that he was influenced by all others surrounding him. And of course that includes parents, well in his case he didn't have father, but parents, teachers, neighbors, and the community, mentors. And I think that speaks to the notion of importance of social and cultural capital. Right? But I'd like to also point out the context of these things. Because even though they grew up in the same kind of similar, poor neighborhoods, they went to different schools. In the state of Maryland, this is one of the 50 states, Maryland, the high school graduation rate is around 76%. Okay? And then the Baltimore County, which consists largely of the suburban areas, it goes up to 85%. And then the Baltimore City, where that the other Westmore attended high school and then dropped out, the graduation rate is 35%. It's shocking, isn't it? So 2 out of 3 kids drop out of high school within the 4-year time frame. Then what happened to the successful one? Actually, he was sent to a military school by his mother. So he didn't have to go to the public high school in the Baltimore City. So I think that raises a really question. What is really the problem? Right? Is it really a problem capacity or choice? In other words, if the other Westmore had attended a public school with really high capacity, right? That has capacity to deliver high quality education, highly qualified and effective teachers, good curriculum and extracurriculum resources, etc. Would we ever succeeded like Westmore, successful one? Or did we still need a choice to move to a better neighborhood and go to better school out of his own neighborhood? So there are really controversies about the 2 different approaches to school accountability. And one approach is the input, what I call the input-driven accountability. And they say, okay, money matters. Okay, we need more money for schools to get better qualified teachers, better curriculum, etc. But the other group of people that advocate the performance-driven accountability, no, we need the incentives through more competition and more choice. So in other words, that the public schools need incentives to learn more efficiently and maximize student performance. So I made a kind of table to show you a typology of education policies and programs. I mean, this is just one way to classify the program, and there could be many other ways. So I already mentioned about this, distinction, right? The input-driven versus performance-driven. I think the question is, for this dimension, the question is, what's wrong with the public schools? Is the problem with the lack of opportunities and lack of capacity to take advantage of the opportunities? If that's the case, then I think the input-driven approach makes sense. But if that the problem is lack of will, motivation, and efforts to improve the performance, then performance-driven approach makes sense. And then another dimension here is the scope of intervention. Who are the beneficiaries of the intervention? Right? So in other words, the question is, who are in trouble in schools? If the trouble is only for the low-achieving students, then we can design more targeted intervention. But if the problem is for everybody, then we need a universal intervention. So as I said, the policy approach, the federal government's policy approach in the 60s and 70s was primarily this cell, input-driven and targeted, like the compensatory programs, Title I Head Start, that target low-achieving, low-income families, and also give more resources, more opportunities, right? But later, in the 1990s and 2000s, the policy kind of moved to this direction, more performance-driven and universal. So we see that the more high-stake testing, school accountability, along with the charter school and school voucher to give more choice options for parents. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this compensatory program. The compensatory program is basically you target these low-achieving students, right? And in theory, it's supposed to help them, and so basically you kind of raise the bottom. One of the potential, the risk of this approach is what we call the Robin Hood effect, right? So we basically take away the resources from the high-achieving students and give those resources more to the low-achieving students. And in that case, it basically becomes a zero-sum game, right? And as we saw in the 60s and 70s, Black and Hispanic students improved achievement, whereas white students did not improve. But to be really, the goal is to improve everybody, so that has a limitation. Then, the more universal approach, which targets, not only the low-achieving but also middle and high-performing students, in theory, that should improve the overall achievement of all students. But in reality, students whose parents have better resources and better information can take advantage of this opportunity. So sometimes what happens is a matching effect. Rich getting richer and poor getting poorer. So the gap is actually widening. Right? So there are, the benefits and the risks. So we have to weigh both at the same time. Now I'm going to switch the gear to talk a little bit about the Australia. And I have to mention first that I haven't really studied Australian education system before I came here. So I only read a couple of reports, like the one here, Gansky report. And so my knowledge is very limited, but the reason I like to mention this is it's just an opportunity to raise a question, and then we can have more discussion after my presentation. So based on the report, the average math achievement of Australian students dropped about 30 points over the past 12 years based on the PISA. And about 20 points drop in reading. It's not huge, but I think that from a statistical viewpoint, it's not something to dismiss as a measurement error or misfortune. Okay? And of course, I don't know the reason, but I think that's something definitely requires investigation. And then the other question to think about is how can Australia, move in the direction of more high-performing nation overall, but at the same time, greater equality of the achievement, a smaller gap. So this is actually the what the OECD report classifies, the nations and territories based on the students' PISA performance. So the vertical axis is excellence as measured by the average test score. And then the horizontal axis is equity, which is measured by the smallness of the gap between high SES and low SES students. The smaller the better, right? And where is Australia? Australia is somewhere in the middle in terms of both excellence and equity, relative to other OECD nations. And the question is, how can Australia move in that direction, right? Not only improving the overall performance, but also narrowing the gap among different socioeconomic groups of students. Okay? And you might notice that there are countries in this box, some countries in this box, like Japan, Korea, Finland, but those are the very, the relatively small countries with a highly homogeneous student population. So maybe not directly, compatible. So I mean, definitely we have to think about the demographic composition because we have different challenges. So I think from that perspective, maybe I think there might be more similarities between the United States and Australia because the United States have about 20% immigrant. And I heard that you guys have about 25%. So anyway, I'd like to talk about some of the lessons that we got from the American education policy experiences, and then talk about the implications for Australia. So I think that this is really might be the most important question. What do you really try to achieve as a nation? And as I said, I think that one of the reasons why the United States was able to narrow the racial and socioeconomic gap in the 60s and 70s is national vision and the leadership for the great society. And I had a chance to look at the ACT government's the Future of Education report. And actually Dr. Musong Lee and I had a chance to visit their offices and talk about some of the issues. And anyway, that report actually kind of mentions the Melbourne Declaration, and the aim was, the more fair and equitable society. Something like that. I mean, we need that kind of vision, clear vision, mobilize everybody. But we have to be aware of the tension between excellence and equity. And then also we have to be aware that the overemphasis on the basic skills may actually hurt the low achieving students because it kind of set the lower expectations for them to grow. So recommendations, we align the goals and the strategies with national vision. So even though it's an education issue, but I think that the education is also closely linked to the social issue, right? So we need both. And then strive for the inclusive excellence. And so pursuing the excellence and equity at the same time. And then more emphasis on the 21st century skills beyond the standardized test scores, right? So the goal is not just college readiness, which is sometimes just focused on the academic skills, but the goal is also career readiness and the citizenship readiness, so that addresses the broad the goals of education, not just literacy and numeracy. Okay, and another important lesson, from the United States, there is no magic bullet. Sometimes, the politicians argue that, okay, this is the way to go, but one size does not fit all, and we learned that many times. And then another important lesson is that schools alone cannot close the gap, and they need partners, strong partners, like the families, the communities. And then gap starts a child birth and grow over time. So we need definitely the early intervention, but at the same time, follow through intervention to make sure that the gap doesn't grow. And then beware the pseudoscience, particularly in this, the post-truth era. Okay. So the continuous improvement cycle. So because there is no magic bullet, we have to keep testing what works in different circumstances. And then select evidence-based, cost-effective programs. And one of the criticisms of American education policy is that it costs too much. And that's one of the reasons why the accountability, the performance-based accountability movement became more popular. Because they argue that high-tech testing is cheap, relatively cheap, right? Quick and cheap fix. So I think that in order to make the argument that, okay, this works, but not just works, but also it has to be efficient, right? So that's why I think that we need to be not just look at the effectiveness side, but also cost side as well. But on the other hand, there is a definitely caveat, because high-stake testing, even though the cost is relatively smaller in the short term, but long term, actually the cost might be even bigger, because it has many unintended negative consequences, like narrowing the curriculum, teaching to test, and sometimes causing the schools to triage students, paying more attention to students who can meet the standards, right, and ignoring the students who are less likely to meet the standard, and consequently that the dropout rate goes up. So I think that definitely we have to think about really the big picture, and then combine performance-driven and input-driven tools based on the needs. And then finally, integrate the education and social policies. Because schools alone cannot fix the problem. And many times that we see that the K-12 or the K-12 education policy is separated from higher education policy, and also separated from the preschool policy, and separated from the workforce development and training policy, because there are all these offices working in silos. There is no coordination of the policy. But what I heard during the visit to the ACT government was that they actually tried to work hard to make that happen. Okay, in terms of impact, I would not be able to show all this data without national assessment, right? So from that perspective, I think the national assessment is very important tool because it provides the evidence as a barometer of social and education inequity. And here, not only we have to think about the average outcome, but also the gaps among different groups. And I know that the Australia use the NAPLAN primarily as an information tool, not as an accountability tool. I might be wrong, but I think that was my impression. And so that's different, definitely, from the United States, where we use the high-stake testing as a tool to hold the schools accountable for outcomes, and there are sanctions, based on the results. But I think that I would like to keep the national assessment as a low-stake testing, because that doesn't bring an issue of contamination. Because once you use it as high-stake testing, then it's no longer valid, because people kind of start gaming the system, right? So you see the inflated test scores over time. And as I said, it is very important to break down the test results for subgroups. And of course, the question is who should be in the subgroups. And in the United States context, what matters was race, ethnicity, poverty, disability, and the English language learner status, the kind of a proxy for the immigrant status. Those are the four main variables that the federal government used to ensure the equity. And of course, that choice might vary from country to country. And then finally, we apply the tiered intervention approach, universal and targeted, depending on the needs. So sometimes, we can start with the universal, but if that doesn't work for some students, those students can be identified for the targeted approach. Okay, but finally, I'd like to wrap up this presentation with a picture of the old school bell in one of the American schools. So the school bell rings, not just for the children in school, but all of us who share the fate of humanity and thus care about the future of all children in all societies in the world. And any child's underachievement is a loss to everyone. Thank you.